Empires are usually remembered for their armies, their rulers, or their monuments. We speak of the Roman legions, the Great Wall of China, or the glittering palaces of Versailles. But there exists another kind of empire, one that was not built on steel or stone but on paper promises. An empire of numbers, of ledgers, of invisible chains. An empire built not on land but on debt. And while it never raised a flag or marched soldiers into battle, it quietly conquered kingdoms, directed the fate of nations, and still holds power over your life today. The story begins in the merchant cities of Renaissance Italy. Florence, Venice, and Genoa were rich, not because they commanded vast armies, but because they commanded money. These city-states were the laboratories where modern banking was born. Families like the Medici discovered that lending to rulers was far more profitable than trading silk or spices. A king might default, but more often he would bow to the power of his creditors, because without their gold, his armies could not march, his palaces could not be built, and his crown itself might slip from his head. Debt became the lifeblood of war. Rulers realized that with borrowed money, they could raise armies far larger than their treasuries would allow. They did not need to wait for taxes to fill their coffers. They could simply mortgage the future. Every victory and every defeat was now entangled in the invisible strings of finance. But the true empire of debt did not remain in Italy. It migrated north, where a small island nation was about to harness it on a scale the world had never seen. In the late 1600s, England was struggling. Wars with France drained the treasury. The government was desperate. And so in 1694, it struck a deal with a group of wealthy merchants. They would lend the crown a vast sum of money, and in return, they would be granted the right to establish a powerful institution, the Bank of England. This was no ordinary bank. It was a machine designed to transform debt into power. The government issued bonds, promises to pay in the future, and the bank sold them to investors. With this money, the state could fight wars far beyond its immediate means. Suddenly, England could raise fleets and armies that dwarfed its rivals. Debt was no longer a weakness. It was a weapon, and as the system grew, it transformed England into a financial superpower. The national debt, once seen as a burden, became the very foundation of the empire. Investors trusted the English government to honor its bonds, and this trust allowed the state to borrow endlessly. Debt financed wars against Napoleon, funded colonies across the globe, and underwrote the Industrial Revolution. But here lies the paradox. While kings and ministers appeared to rule, behind them stood creditors, bankers, and bondholders. The true empire was not ruled from Buckingham Palace or Westminster, but from counting houses and coffee shops where debts were traded like commodities. Invisible rulers, with no armies and no crowns, dictated the fate of nations through ledgers and contracts. Consider this. Napoleon himself once remarked that he feared not the armies of England, but its bankers. He knew that while his victories required treasure, his enemies could conjure resources seemingly out of thin air, sustained by an endless stream of loans. His cannons were limited by coin. Their cannons were fueled by credit. And England was not alone. The Dutch before them had built their golden age on similar financial foundations, and later the United States would perfect the model. Wars, infrastructure, expansion, all financed through a growing web of debt. This secret empire of debt operated without borders. Its subjects were not soldiers, but entire populations, bound by taxes that repaid the loans of their rulers. When kings borrowed, it was their people who paid the interest. And when nations defaulted, it was ordinary citizens who suffered inflation, higher prices, and economic collapse. In the 19th century, European powers extended this system beyond their shores. Loans were offered to young nations in Latin America and the Middle East with terms so crippling that default was almost guaranteed. And when defaults came, the creditors sent warships, seized ports, and dictated policies. Empires were built not through conquest, but through contracts. By the time the 20th century dawned, the empire of debt had grown so vast it was almost invisible. Governments depended on it, businesses thrived on it, and individuals were enticed into it. Mortgages, consumer loans, credit cards, debt had trickled down from kings to commoners. The invisible empire had embedded itself in everyday life, and today it rules more powerfully than ever. Entire nations operate on borrowed money. Governments roll over debts that can never truly be repaid. Central banks manipulate interest rates, conjure liquidity, and print money to keep the system alive. You do not vote for these bankers, yet their decisions affect your job, your savings, and the value of the money in your pocket. This is the true legacy of that empire. Not a palace or a monument, but a system where power is not measured in land but in promises, where wealth is not stored in gold but in paper and digits, where the conquerors are not generals but financiers, We are taught to see history as battles, kings, and revolutions. But look deeper, and you will find that behind each turning point there is a financial story. The Crusades financed by Italian loans. The American Revolution sparked in part by British taxation to pay debts. World wars fought with borrowed billions. Debt is the silent partner of history. It builds empires and it destroys them. It fuels prosperity and it triggers collapse. It is the chain that binds nations and individuals alike. And so the next time you look at a map of the world, remember, the greatest empire is not marked by borders or banners. It is the empire of debt. Invisible, unacknowledged, but inescapable. An empire you live in every single day.